We are under the same stars tonight.
So today I've got Lewis Winks on the podcast. Now, Lewis, he's very much involved with the Right to Roam movement and is also a founder of the Stars Are For Everyone, which is a protest group. Can I describe it as a protest group?
Yeah, we're a grassroots campaign group. The Stars Are For Everyone was set up to defend the right to wild camp on Dartmoor specifically. So defend our right to the night sky and to sleep under the stars, hence the name.
Right, I'm drinking out of one of your mugs at the moment, Lewis, and it's got the old Crockin on it. Now, and I already know the story of the old Crockin. My 7-year-old daughter went on the protest in Dartmoor, which you co-organised. I wasn't able to go, unfortunately, because I had a camp that day. Can you explain the significance of the Crockin?
Yeah, so Old Crockin is a myth, a story, in many ways a parable really, for caring for the land and for the true spirit of Dartmoor. And it's a story that originates from the moors. Well, there are many accounts of it, but the more often told account of Old Crockin dates back from early 1800s. And the story is of a wealthy gentleman who travels to Dartmoor from London in order to improve Dartmoor, improve its pastures, using steam power, in order to extract profit from the land. And so sees Dartmoor as this place to be improved and a place for him to make lots of money out of. Sound familiar? Anyway, he comes to Dartmoor, and up on Crockin Tor one day, which is up near Wistman's Wood, this wealthy man, Mr. Vowler, is out walking, and he meets one of the locals up there, one of the commoners up on Dartmoor, and the commoner says, "Oh, Mr. Vowler, I had a dream about you the other night." Mr. Vowler says, "Oh, okay. What was that dream about then?" And he says, "Oh, in the dream I met Old Crockin, the spirit of the moors, and this Old Crockin is described in his dream as this kind of creature with skin like granite and eyebrows like sedges and moss-like kind of hair adorning him, lichen all over his body, and eyes like inky, peaty pools."
Sounds like a Roald Dahl character.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so well described. And this commoner says, "Mr. Vowler, Old Crockin said to pass on a message to you. He said, if Mr. Vowler scratches my back, I'll scratch out his pockets." Meaning, of course, if he improves Dartmoor, if he tries to plough it up, then he'll bankrupt him. And so it happened. Mr. Vowler discounted those words of the commoner and went ahead and tried to improve the pasture of Dartmoor, and his crops failed, and it wasn't possible. And Dartmoor and Old Crockin saw him off back to London, and he did indeed go bankrupt. And so it became this kind of parable. And when we were reading, recounting exactly a year ago, actually, so on the 10th of October in 2022, we went up onto Dartmoor, a small group of us, 8 or 9 of us, and camped up on the Commons. And we camped on Stool Moor. And the reason we chose Stool Moor is because at the time there was an emerging court challenge, a legal challenge in the High Court, where Alexander Darwell, a wealthy landowner who had travelled from London and moved in 2012, I believe, to Dartmoor, had decided to challenge in the High Court the right to wild camp. And this is a long existing right that has been enjoyed for generations up on Dartmoor, and was kind of ratified in law in 1985 as part of the Dartmoor Commons Act. And Alexander Darwell decided that actually this should be challenged and there's no right to camp on Dartmoor. Was planning to take it to court, but before the court case we went up to Dartmoor and we camped up on Stool Moor on Alexander Darwell's land, where at the time we had permission, or not permission, a right rather, to camp. And in the evening we were sat around and we told this story, we recounted this story, and we just really felt that it was this parable of what is the true spirit of Dartmoor, the true spirit to us is not overturning historic and customary rights of access. The true spirit is a sort of a feeling of belonging in landscapes, and this sort of feeling of taking care for what we love. And it was in that moment that a kind of resistance was born, really, against this kind of callous act of greed and desire to take away a long existing right. And so and with it was kind of born this idea to invoke and summon the spirit of Old Crocken. So on your mug it says, "The spirit of Dartmoor, Old Crocken rises." Indeed, Old Crocken did rise.
Yeah, and it looks a bit like one of the Norsemen of the Apocalypse.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's very evocative.
Well, there's various descriptions of Old Crocken, and so the description that I gave in that story was the one that we actually used in our protest. But on the mug, you've got the kind of the horseman, and actually, like in some tales, Old Crocken's related to the Whist Hounds of Wistman's Wood, and to the Wild Hunt, to Herne the Hunter, to this kind of figure of a hunter that takes to the moors and kind of hunts down sort of corrupted spirits and kind of brings balance to the land. And on the mug, there's a figure with what looks like a kind of a deer or a cattle skull with antlers, and the horse is a skeleton horse, and those often are associated with Herne the Hunter, which is a very famous tale in itself. And so there's lots of various kind of overlapping stories, especially on Dartmoor, which relate to the otherworldly and to the kind of land-based spirits.
Mm-hmm.
We are under the same star.
So, speaking of Herne the Hunter, isn't it? There's a story in Nick Hayes' book where he goes to visit. Is it the tree that is the symbol of Herne the Hunter?
Yeah, because Herne the Hunter, what was apparently strung up in a tree, and I think in Nick Hayes' book, and this is in the final chapter of his book,
this is the Book of Trespass.
The Book of Trespass. He imagines Herne the Hunter kind of leading this kind of ragtag group of kind of eco-activists into this sort of like in a form of resistance. I mean, Herne was a kind of outlaw figure, but a sort of a figure that was kind of almost feared and in the end kind of hunted down himself.
So he's an anti-establishment sort of Robin Hood figure.
Exactly, Robin Hood. And Robin Hood is also a modern version of Herne himself. So these kind of like woodland dwelling spirits that are not to be messed with. Yeah,
so rich symbolism there. And so if you want to go deep back into your sort of folklore, if you're into your folklore stories, Herne the Hunter is a great one to learn about. But as a symbol as well for the movement or the activism in general against some of the restrictions being brought in through firstly the Darwell case, which was overturned in the end. So partly thanks to the likes of yourself, Lewis, for the Right to Roam movement, who managed to get enough momentum. Well, it was a legal case. Let's face it, it was a legal case. So it was the judge that decided. But there is also a populist movement now, which didn't exist before. Would you say, or do you think it did exist, but it just didn't have a voice?
I mean, I think that there's a deep history of challenging the kind of the ethos that's sort of the landed, aristocratic, kind of moneyed idea of stewardship that only those that kind of own land should have access to and should have kind of a say over how that land is managed. And actually, you can look back to the 1930s to how the kind of land access movement was born of the kind of like northern working class communities wanting access to the moors above their house, which were kind of kept for grouse shooting. And when you look at those kind of mass trespasses that took place in the 1930s, there was 10,000 people took to Winnett's Pass, which in the end actually then gave us the National Parks Act, which gave us these kind of spaces which we're now protecting and defending today. So I think that there's a long history, but more recently, in the last 3 years, we've had a kind of a more recent incarnation of what has gone before in the 1930s and then in the 1990s. These kind of movements to sort of try to bring back into common access and in a sense, not necessarily ownership, but much more about kind of our sense of belonging to land. The idea that we can actually access land and be part of the solution, and not simply be seen as the problem. And the Right to Roam movement has done a huge amount since 2020 to do that. So kind of emerging out of the pandemic, we could see that access to land was going to become a really, really pressing issue for people. We've only got access to 8% of land, which we've only had since year 2000, since we had the Countryside and Rights of Way Act came in, and actually, like, it's so insufficient.
It took an act of protest to get that act.
Well, precisely. So we look back to the 1990s, and there were many groups. The Ramblers very much at the forefront of this kind of quite radical spearheading of something which at the time seems kind of almost impossible, but actually led to that Labour government bringing in the Countryside and Rights of Way Act. It was very watered down, lobbied against, and we ended up with 8% from a desire to have something much greater. The thing that we're pointing to in this campaign, the kind of like, here we are in 2023, going on a quarter of a century after that act was brought in, and we can see that if you look up in Yorkshire, for example, you've got over half of the landscape is accessible to people. Down here in Devon, we have about 9.5% of Devon is accessible. Over in Kent, you've got about 1.5% of the land. Cambridgeshire even less.
Is that because it's agricultural?
Well, it's for a mixture of... Yeah, I mean, when you look at how we've defined access in England and in Wales, the Countryside and Rights of Way Act gives access mainly to the uplands. And so when you look at it from a land use perspective, then of course places like the Lake District, places like the Yorkshire Dales, are going to have vast amounts of access. There are other designations as well, so historic commons, so you could look at the New Forest, and also there's plenty of access land there. There's also designated land like Forestry Commission land, which is anything which is within public ownership, as a default would be in there. So the New Forest has got quite a lot. There are organisations like the Woodland Trust also would designate some of their land for public access. The National Trust do the same. But by and large, what we would call kind of open access land exists in the uplands, and that's a problem for the many, many people who don't live with upland areas near them. Yeah.
So, I mean, one of the arguments that's always used, I suppose, by the relevant authorities is the word stewardship, which is always used as a sort of example of, I suppose, self-justification, why they're there in the first place. But then stewardship can also be something that we, members of the public, can exercise ourselves through being connected with nature. And, stewardship, which is when responsibility is taken on behalf of somebody else, it can be a double-edged sword, can't it? It can be something that actually denies that kind of connection to people. When you have the sort of patriarchal kind of authority saying, no, we're taking care of this now, you don't take care of that. Is that an argument that you hear used a lot?
Well, it's very easy with the campaign, and the point we've got to at the moment is very much Labour, the likely next government, have said that they will bring in a Right to Roam Act. We don't know what the details look like at the moment, but what we're campaigning for is a sort of a presumption of access to land in England. Now, from a kind of legal point of view, you might pass an Act of Parliament that gives people that access, but what we're very focused on is actually what that means. So what does it mean to be, as you say, stewards or guardians of land? Does it mean that you have to be a landowner? Our vision is that you, by having access to land, can be part of a kind of cultural shift, which is about bringing people into a form of kind of reciprocal responsibility for land. So we want to move beyond this idea that recreation is about extracting an experience from a landscape, that actually by being in a landscape, you are learning about it, you're seeing the flowers, you're witnessing the changing seasons, you can feel that kind of shifting of from kind of being there for some kind of like adrenaline-filled experience to actually something which is much more about being in a relationship with a place. And it's that relationship with place that we often hear, like, for example, farmers who are very good stewards of the land, those farmers who are good stewards of the land actually talk about kind of like their relationship with the land. And, our vision is that can be shared between many people. And what we're seeing at the moment in this country is a huge deficit in terms of people's connection to nature, and connectedness to nature is the lowest in Britain and across the whole of Europe. We also have declining wildlife, and the belief is that the two are very connected. So we're not even witnessing, we don't even know what we're losing because we can't see it and we're not taking notice of it. So bringing people back into taking notice of the natural world is about having access to it. If we don't have access to it, we're not going to see it, we're not going to be able to connect to it, we're not going to love it, we're not going to be able to look after it. And you just take a very simple example of a tree. I mean, you can see a tree in a landscape, but if you want to know what's living on that tree, or what the bark feels like, or see it through all of its seasons, and see the kind of the caterpillars that live on the leaves and so on, you need to get close to it. You need to form some kind of relationship with it. That sounds really romantic, but actually, like, it's the heart really of what we need to shift from a kind of like cultural perspective.
Yeah, so not something, being in nature, not something to be consumed or commodified, but something to be firstly experienced internally, and then maybe goes towards forming a sort of relationship that becomes part of your motivation.
Well, it's interesting because the court case that we were talking about earlier, the wild camping court case, in the end came down to a definition of what we mean by recreation, and it got absurd in the end because the representatives on behalf of the Darwalls were making the case that actually sleeping can't be recreation because you're asleep and it's not fun, or it almost came down to that. And then on the other side it was like, well, actually sleeping is recreation because it's part of what enables people to kind of do a long walk, or stargaze, or bird watch, or whatever else it is you're doing. But actually I think that it's almost sort of misleading to focus on recreation, or at the very least we need to redefine what we mean by recreation, because at the moment if we talk about recreation, we talk about it's something that we do in our spare time, so it's kind of like a leisure activity, and it's therefore seen as a luxury rather than like a central part of who we are as humans. And B, it's seen as very extractive, so it's linked with hedonistic kind of pursuits, it's linked with the sort of the adrenaline fuel. And like, nothing against doing that, but actually like there's an opening there. And if you look at kind of how values are kind of situated within like social and psychological research, the values associated with hedonism are very, very linked to these kind of benevolent, kind of what you might look at as like nature centered, the kind of values which would allow us to sort of bring ourselves back into a kind of relationship where we can see ourselves as stewards, you were talking about. So it's not a very big leap for those of us that enjoy our walking, our bike riding, our running, whatever else it is, bird watching, the things that give us a bit of a buzz in our lives. It's very, very short leap from a psychological perspective to then actually see ourselves being part of something much bigger, and see ourselves as being part of the solution, really. And again, thinking to the wild camping case, we're kind of told that wild campers leave rubbish and that they do damage to the landscape, and actually that might be the case for very few examples, but mostly people are taking away really formative experiences that are guiding them in their lives and are kind of like shaping people's behaviours going forward. And we know that, we've been told that by so many people who were on the protest in January were getting the train up to the protest kind of in floods of tears because of how important those experiences were for them in early life. And the countless Duke of Edinburgh and 10 tours, groups that have been running since the 1960s, people getting in touch with us and saying, if it wasn't for those experiences, I would be a very different person today. I think we need to rethink what we really mean by recreation.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, and I've experienced that myself through my line of work, and the connection that people maybe rediscover later in life, and the connection people have maybe early on in life where they've had an experience or a connection with nature, and it's actually influenced them on a subconscious level they're not even aware of. And that when they really look at it, they realise that actually that's been responsible for a lot of their life choices ever since. They just haven't examined it before. And it's really interesting when you really look at it under the microscope. When you look at lots of research into people's relationship with nature, whether they've had a memorable experience, whether it's a bad experience, good experience, or an ecstatic experience, equally they can both go on to influence their connection. Yeah. There's a lot of evidence to show that people's intention towards behaviour that is environmentally conscious is shaped from early connections quite often. And so, that intention, which if it's to be followed up, has got to be informed by having a relationship. So if you're denied a relationship and you're told, you don't go there, don't do this, don't do that, you're not really able to set an intention because you're not having that connection.
We are under the same stars tonight.
So anyway, moving on. I wanted to ask you, Lewis, about your trip to Scotland. So you recently went to Scotland because it's an interesting parallel, I suppose, with the right to roam that exists in England and Wales and in Scotland, where they've had a right to roam which is more universal. So why did you go there and what did you learn?
So the context of this is that in Scotland, since 2003, there has existed a presumption of access to all of Scotland's land and water. So people have a right to access most of Scotland, not private gardens, not dangerous sites, not certain designated sites which are very sensitive to disturbance for habitat and wildlife reasons, but by and large most of Scotland the balance is in favour of access, and so I suppose what that means is that the assumption would be that you can access land and the exception would be that you couldn't, whereas in England we have the very opposite. So the exception is that you can access land, and as we've already discussed, in many places there's very little land that you can access, so you kind of, in England we're kind of existing in these like narrow corridors between these kind of large areas which are off limits, whereas in Scotland actually there's large areas people can access. Now we went there as a campaign group largely based in England to the Scottish border, and we trespassed up to the border, and we were carrying...
Where did you go?
So we went up to the Langholm estate, just northeast of Carlisle, and the Langholm estate, actually where we were based for that event, was a community buyout of a large area of land which was bought out, I think 4 or 5 years ago now, and so it's a kind of a symbol of hope for what might happen if we were to able to shift things in favour of communities and people for whom belonging to, and the kind of even the kind of like paper-based sense of ownership has been taken. And in Scotland, there's a large movement for kind of land reform, and we've got the Isle of Egg in Scotland, which was a sort of a whole island that was bought by a community. But obviously, the Langholm estate is not an island, but in many senses, it is an island because it's an island of land that belongs to a community in amongst the sort of vast acreages of these large estates, often owned offshore and so on, or by kind of Norman conquest aristocracy, and so we went up to the Scottish border and we were welcomed there by this community, and then we went actually up beyond the Langholm estate onto the borderland, and obviously in England we were trespassing. As soon as we got to the Scottish border and we stepped over the border, then that no longer became a thing, and so it was very symbolic. We were doing that in order to be symbolic. We met on the border a group of Scottish activists that were involved in bringing in the Land Reform Act in 2003. And we exchanged, we gave them a bottle of Newcastle brown ale and they gave us a bottle of whiskey, and we kind of sang some songs. And
I think you'll find it's Newcastle, Lewis.
Newcastle brown ale. And it was a great event. I mean, it was very symbolic. It was very interesting to kind of witness the shift between going from England into Scotland, and we stood on Scots Dyke, which was kind of dug in the 1500s as to mark out the boundary between two countries, but at the time it was just an administrative boundary. It was never a boundary which restricted any rights. It was just simply people would go between It's only since then.
So a lot of
we've had
people
the
think
trespass
Hadrian's
law.
Wall is the official, which is mistaken, isn't it? It's
Yeah,
not
well, in
really.
places it is the boundary, but actually, in this particular area, it's got that, which is a very small, it's this kind of little mound really that we crossed in this kind of birch copse and crossed this little mound, and we did the hokey cokey on there, so we had one leg in, one leg out, shake it all about, and then crossed over and off we went, and we then heard from some of those activists that were involved in the early days of the Scottish Land Reform Act, who kind of basically shared their wisdom with us and were saying, what it took to bring about such a change that would give people this kind of much further reaching access to land. One of the things, and an often said kind of misunderstanding around the Scottish access laws that we hear a lot is that, in Scotland the landscape's totally different. Of course it works in Scotland because there's these like vast open areas which are very sparsely populated. That's true of the Highlands, right? But when you look at the Central Belt...
And also can't be cultivated as well, presumably.
Yeah, sure. So, you've got... and there's lots of kind of challenges that go with that around kind of reforestation and the kind of the ecosystems and so on. But actually from like an access point of view, there's a sort of a difference in the Highlands, but if you look at the Central Belt and the area around Glasgow, the reason that the Land Reform Act came in was not to give people access to the Highlands, because there was already an assumed access, which was historical and a kind of customary set of access rights, which weren't written down in law, but were assumed in common law. In the Highlands. So nobody that's in the 1990s was stopping anybody from hiking in the Highlands, but what wasn't available was the same access rights for people living in the Central Belt. So this was always about giving people living in Glasgow the opportunity to go out into the Green Belt and to enjoy access to the countryside who live in the city. So actually, when you look at it from a Central Belt point of view, it's very comparable to what we have in England. And so we've got this great example of what was made possible. And with that come all of the same challenges around how do you manage access alongside livestock and crops? How do you manage kind of the general concern around people getting to the countryside? And what they brought in was what is called the Scottish Code of Access, or which gives everything from camping codes all the way through to walking and path usage. Things like certain times of year when certain activities are restricted due to bird nesting, a lot of it is covered, and this is a kind of like an accessible language version of the law, really. Yeah.
Would it be possible to have a common law right to roam, which coexisted with landowners' rights, which are not maybe so entrenched in law, i.e. the recent Crime and Justice Bill, the police bill, I forget what it's called, the one that came in 2022, which really reinforced the trespass laws to the nth degree to criminalise people who basically just want to hang out in a place with a bunch of other people who are like-minded.
Yeah. Sorry, go on. What's your question?
So is it not possible, instead of trying to seek some kind of precedence, which I think is what Darwin was trying to do, to basically make something that was entrenched in the local bylaw?
So what was being challenged on Dartmoor was a bylaw which existed since 1985. So on Dartmoor, it's the only place in England where we currently have the right to wild camp. That's just 0.2% of England, so, a tiny portion. So I think that the question is about kind of, well, why can't we basically come up with our own kind of common laws of access? Is it?
Yeah. So I mean, one of the things that the legal system in this country used to be praised for was its ability to navigate through a kind of common sense, common law approach, which appealed to sort of like, let's call it a British sense of pragmatism.
Yeah.
But that seems to have just disappeared in so many ways.
Well, if you speak to the Scottish activists who were involved in the changes that we saw north of the border, they will say that we do have a right of access to the countryside, because there's a right of presumed access, and there's a sort of presumed right, which is only made not a right by somebody kind of asserting otherwise, and actually in
conforming.
Yeah, And so if we all decided tomorrow that there was no such thing as law of trespass, then there wouldn't be, because it's still only a civil law issue. So it's kind of very similar to having a dispute with your neighbour about a fence boundary. And actually, there's no criminal case to be answered for trespass unless it's aggravated trespass, unless you damage property. It would be very, very hard for any landowner to bring anybody to court for trespass. But the exception to that, which has been at the root of the Police Crime and Sentencing Act, which has criminalised travelling communities, because it's made it it's the right to reside, which is the thing which has been at the heart of the changes to trespass law. And so that if you're staying overnight in a van or whatever for one night or more, then you're then in breach of that act, which would then be a criminal law issue. And so, and actually that's recently been changed now to make it only one vehicle, because before it was a group of vehicles. So what we can see is and this is a really important point, because in the movement for land justice and land access, we can see that actually, like, wild camping's become a bit of a cause célèbre for the land access movement. But of course, it's just fighting a fight which has been fought by travelling communities, by people on the receiving end of feudal systems and peasant communities for not just in this country, but obviously all over the world, and those fights are still going on. And I think it's really important to see this in the bigger context, that we're seeing criminalised a way of life, a way of travelling life, which, beginning with Henry VIII rounding up gypsies in a New Forest, you've got this kind of like modern. And then the Enclosure Acts, which went after that, and basically like shooed people off the land and dispossessed people from a kind of feeling of belonging on land. With wild camping, with the modern land access movement, all of that is in mind, because what we want to do is stop and roll back this kind of framework of enclosure, or what in Scotland has been called clearance of land, and actually look at bringing people back into landscapes, and not just like from a kind of like a physical presence in landscapes, but also in this kind of like a lived presence, like an experiential presence that goes way beyond what we were talking about earlier about recreation.
The stars are for everyone.
So I was going to talk to you about that. I was going to talk to you about the word privilege, which gets used a lot when it comes to access issues, and I watched the Right to Roam film the other day with you, Lewis, and it was a nicely made film by Charlotte Bill and the Clapham Film Unit. And one of the things that comes up is just how marginalised the Roma travelling community has become as a result of this law, but how that, in a way, they've been given a voice. And as you say, it's the same issues, but it just affects a wider group of people now. And that's why it's kind of come to light, whereas actually it's probably always affected the traveller community. But the word privilege, so in terms of what you're saying about the Glaswegians being given access to the mountains, and the same applies here, I suppose, if you're a single mum who doesn't have transport, who's not able to get to, say, Dartmoor on a weekend, does the Right to Roam movement sort of provide access or a voice even to express their lack of opportunity? When I was at the Bristol Run Show, I met some ladies who, I think they're called the Stepping Sisters, and they were basically representing ethnic minority groups who you very rarely see in the countryside, and that's another issue. And so all of these minority groups have come together under the Right to Roam. I know it because I've seen it, because you just suddenly see a mishmash of cultures which you maybe don't see in other protest movements. When I was a journalist, I had to cover the Countryside Alliance March, and almost everyone was in tweed and almost everybody was white. Whereas the Right to Roam movement, I'm not sure it is.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge amount in that question, isn't there? Because, I mean, this is being part of any kind of protest movement, especially of this type that involves kind of access to land and also being kind of transgressive within a landscape. There's a privilege that goes with that, and the privilege is about who already feels that they are entitled and belong to the land, by merit of simply of birth. There is already a kind of a sense in, this is also borne out in the research. The Landscapes Review from 2018, otherwise known as the Glover Review, was pointing out just how it's the same people accessing and taking part in recreation in our protected areas, our national parks and AOMB landscapes, who are mostly white. Like we can see that it's white, wealthier communities who are going to these places. Younger people, people from black, minority, ethnic communities are not, and I think we have to ask serious questions about why that is. I mean, why is it that we are not able to do better for those communities? And I think one of the main things is that people often don't see themselves in those places. We're not good at representing people who might not kind of classically be represented in those spaces, and I think it's a massive barrier. There's more in Right to Roam. We're fighting not just to kind of open up the physical barriers of access for people, but also there are massive cultural and social barriers that exist. So I think that's one thing in that in many protest movements there comes a kind of privilege. If you want to be like trespassing, where a lot of our actions involve trespass, who feels safe on a trespass? As a white man, I'm happy to walk off a footpath and go and sit under a tree and not think anything of it. There are many people, whether it's because of their gender, the colour of their skin, like whatever it might be, that actually would feel unsafe doing that in a landscape. And I think that what we have to see is that this is part of a kind of an intersectional approach to winning back rights of access, but also the right to feel welcome, the right to feel belonging. Going back to the January protest up on Dartmoor, it was interesting to see that within that protest there was young people or old people. There were many people who are not wild campers, and people up there who were talking about being there because they wanted this for other people. So there's an intergenerational kind of justice issue there about what do we see. How do we see this evolving in 50 years' time? When my daughter is potentially taking her children up to Dartmoor, what kind of experiences are they going to have? There was also the Roma wheel flag, the flag of the Romany was up there on Dartmoor with us. The kind of sense that we have these kind of, we're standing there alongside others who may or may not be physically represented in those moments, but actually there's a sort of solidarity with other causes who have historically or presently been dispossessed from land because of a whole variety of different political, economic, social, cultural reasons that come together, which puts a real, I think, need for those of us that are in a position to agitate for change to do that, and not just to sit idly by. Just because if there was no right to camp on Dartmoor, I would still go up there and wild camp, is not a reason for me to sit on my arse and not do anything for those people that don't feel safe or welcome there.
Yeah, okay. So I suppose I wanted to ask you, because you have your own business. It's a research business where I'm guessing you're quite educated about the importance of knowing the law and the importance of knowing historical fact that goes into protest. You've also been involved in some sort of negotiations with political parties, but only in terms of presumably as part of your involvement with Right to Roam. Why doesn't one of the political parties, i.e. Labour, for example, make it part of their manifesto to widen Right to Roam? Surely it's a vote winner.
That's our task now. We have to make sure this gets into manifestos. It's really important that political parties do more than just simply say words that people want to hear. We can see from the Conservative Party conference, which is happening right now, that the Right to Roam's already been mentioned yesterday like 5 or 6 times, with Ceri Rees saying that the only people that should have access to the land are farmers and their pigs. So basically saying that pigs should have more rights to land. And this is becoming a bit of a political football. Labour need to step up. Lib Dems are beginning to step up. Our kind of hope is to see that this becomes a campaign issue. It's clearly an issue of public importance. We had a YouGov poll commissioned 6 to 8 weeks ago now that showed that across the political spectrum there was support for a right to roam on England's land and water. 62% of the public across the political spectrum agree that we should have this. So, yeah, I mean, what we want to see really from political parties, probably Labour coming into power next, would be not only to say that we will pass a law giving a presumption of access, but also to vitally support it with resources for education, more funding for national park authorities, local access forums, links to local areas that can become kind of these mediators of access and issues and disputes, funding for farmers as part of the ELMS payments that go in as part of their kind of countryside stewardship payments, which give access. So, and also funding for footpaths, because they're important too, because a lot of people don't want to leave the footpath or can't leave the footpath for other access needs. So I think we need this whole kind of plethora of options for people, but also funding. And you know, we could pass a law, we're not going to change culture overnight, but one thing that's going to help massively would be, for example, giving all young people in schools overnight experiences in a protected landscape, which was part of a government recommendation in 2018. Imagine if Dartmoor National Park Authority had the funding to be able to work with every local school in the area to give them experiences on Dartmoor about what it means to responsibly wild camp.
Would give them a much broader remit as well, wouldn't it?
We point to the deficit of people's experience and education because they haven't had the opportunity to take part in those activities, and so later in life they go and seek them out and don't have that basis. We can look to countries like Norway, like Scotland, like Germany, Sweden, where it's so kind of embedded into young people's opportunities from right from the outset, that by the time they reach young adulthood, it's kind of ingrained into like, how do you kind of responsibly look after places that you're enjoying, whether it's packing litter home with you, or whether it's like not cutting down trees for firewood. How do you take water from a stream safely without making yourself ill?
Yeah.
And these are things that I would guess most people are not being taught in school.
Yeah, because I mean, the school I went to, it's a comprehensive school in Newcastle, D.A.V. was a very marginal thing, and you barely even heard of it, and that was quite a privileged thing.
Yeah.
And I guess that must be even more so now.
Yeah, and it's often kind of D&V. I did D&V when I was at school, and it was a way of like filling a Wednesday afternoon. But it was often kind of pitted against other things. So you do D&V if you didn't want to like play hockey or whatever else it was. It was like whatever else was on offer. Yeah. It's like
bunk off PE. Let's do D&V.
Yeah, it was PE or something. So I think we need to just go much deeper. I mean. This isn't just about kind of learning to read a map, and as good as D&V is, this is much more about feeling less apologetic about our place in the landscape, and learning about what it means to kind of like really enjoy that kind of joint shared responsibility for places. I think. The summary is that what we've got at the moment is not working. The road ahead, by kind of shifting things, is not going to be straightforward either. But it's a much, much better alternative than allowing people to become more disassociated with the world around them.
Mm.
The stars are for everyone, for the lost and the found. We have found solid ground.
Well done for taking up the cudgels, Lewis, and I am certainly really, really hoping that you carry on making progress, and I'm definitely consider myself to be an activist now.
You've been really supportive of the Dartmoor appeal, and you ran some amazing events which in order to raise money for the appeal process and raise awareness, and the appeal fundraiser got to over £100,000, which now, thanks to the Darwalls losing their case, that money will be returned and will all be used for educational purposes in the national park to give people experience.
Okay, that's great.
Park. So but yeah, just thank you for your support and for bringing these conversations to a different audience.
Yeah, a different audience. Well, I've got 2 weeks' time. I've got to fulfil my pledge, which is the other part of what I said I'd do, which is to even though the court case has been won, I'm going to keep going because People have sponsored me, and I haven't finished what I said I'd do.
Yeah.
So I've got to I've got to do an Everest run up Stormore. So I'm going to do that for 10 hours.
2 weeks time.
Yeah, well,
Starting you
I'm inviting people. I mean, it's extremely dull to watch. Some guy like sweating out of his bum, just running up and down the same way, literally all day. And I haven't been particularly well prepared for it because I've been a bit ill recently, and I slightly lost my running mojo a few weeks back. So I'm probably as unfit as I've been in about 2 years. But I think that the motivation to do something that I set my intention on doing at the start of the year will get me through it. So, yeah.
I'm sure it'll be great, man. Yeah, good luck with that.
We have found solid ground. The stars are for everyone. Let the sky sing a song, telling us we belong, and the right to roam is our right. We are under the same stars tonight. Well, is this your countryside? Is this your land? You tell me it's your property and that I'm not allowed, but please be kind. We are under the same stars tonight, and the right to roam is our right. We are under the same stars tonight. The stars are for everyone, for the lost and the found. We have found solid ground. The stars are for everyone. Let the sky sing a song, telling us we belong, and the right to roam is our right. We are under the same stars tonight. Well, I do not own anything, no penny to my name. This land does not belong to me, but I belong to every blade of grass, and you'll find we are under the same stars tonight, and the right to roam is our right. We are under the same stars tonight. The tonight.